There are very few times in American history where you can find one demographic of people who have one thing in common with each other, all experienced the exact same pain points. Even 9/11, it sparked amazing patriotism across America. But if you were in New York or Washington on 9/11, your feelings are vastly different than Grant Hewitt watching it on the Today Show, except now we're talking about parents and COVID and school closures, and almost every parent in America for 2 weeks experienced the exact same thing. And so what I witnessed happened in the movement is that.
Welcome back to the OpenEd podcast. I am excited to have my colleague, Grant Hewitt, with me. Grant has been around the education policy, education choice space for a long time in a lot of capacities and has seen every different approach in many different states. So I want to kind of start with historically, for ever since the advent of compulsory public school in the early 1900s, you really had public school and then you had private schools, which were either very expensive or, maybe parochial Catholic schools that had some scholarships and things. But it was a pretty small number of people that were in private school. And then maybe around the 60s, homeschooling kind of became this idea, this thing. It was mostly illegal, but there was a small number of people doing it. Became a real movement in the 80s and 90s, became legalized, became more popular. But until quite recently, I mean, there were efforts in the 90s for things like vouchers, but on a large scale, until probably close to 2000, you really had public school, private school if you could afford it, or homeschool where you're completely on your own and using your own resources and whatever. So, and you're paying tax dollars to support the public school system, but you don't use it. You don't get those taxes back. That was kind of where we were. And the earliest school choice stuff, at least that I was familiar with, a lot of it came from recommendations from Milton Friedman's book on the idea of vouchers. Hey, if you don't actually use the public school, how about you just get a voucher that lets you use it to pay for a private school? So we've had vouchers. Since then, in the last 20 years, and especially in the last 5, the number of different things out there that are it's crazy. It's proliferated. So I want to kind of sit and I want to get your snapshot of the landscape of everything that's out there between, I didn't even mention charter schools, the charter school movement, the vouchers for private schools. Now you have education savings accounts, you have tuition tax credits, you have virtual programs that are run by a public school that serve homeschoolers or part-time students, enrichment. It's this crazy explosion of options. I want to know your real take thoughts on the pros and cons of some of these things. So I don't know where you want to start.
Yeah. So it's been a journey. So I got into the private school choice space as a kid. I was a product of philanthropic school choice. So I have a learning disability. That disability made it very hard to learn in a traditional setting, but it wasn't debilitating. It just made it harder. My mother looked for something different, didn't see it, raised by a single mom, and she was talking to her colleagues, and they said, well, there's this church that has a private school that helps kids with special needs. Maybe it's a place for your child. I didn't know until I was in my 30s that was actually paid for by the church, that it wasn't out of my own family's hands. And my life was exploded at that moment, because when I learned that, I was also in the process of helping Nevada bring forward the first universal education savings account after it had been passed in Arizona and Florida, but in limited capacities. And that was in 2015. And that's from there, we see an explosion of conversations around educational freedom. The courts shut down the education savings account program in Nevada, but in 2021, we see universal choice come to West Virginia through an education savings account. And you had vouchers in Indiana that are ginormous and taking over there. I mean, I think they have over 60,000 people getting vouchers in Indiana. And so you had this explosion, and all of it's driven, to your point, by this concept of Milton Friedman creating a market, creating the free market in education. And how do you do that? And what do you see to do that? For a long time, I think the folks on the school choice side, and you aren't going to hear me talk about school choice a lot. I believe in calling this educational freedom. How do you empower families to access the freedom that they have? And I don't think we're asking parents, what we're seeing in this movement today is about parents being given more freedom. I think it's actually about parents taking back the freedom that they've always had as parents. And so we're seeing this momentum across the country happen. I hate to say it, in politics, people get a little envious of others. So when you get a state that gets excited, you get neighboring states that are like, well, I have to do something. And actually, we saw that in Arizona. So we see West Virginia go fully universal in 20, I believe it was 21. In 22, Arizona's like, whoa, we've been doing this a long time. I have to be universal.
Yep.
And so they go that route as well. And you start seeing these dominoes start to fall, whether you're in Iowa or Arkansas.
There are times when federalism works as it was intended to.
Correct. So, but then you get exciting new experiments. So you get what's happening in Oklahoma, which is very interesting. And this was pitched as a refundable tax credit. How it implemented was very different. But this is actually two tax credits. There's a tuition tax credit of $7,000 if you are going to a private school. Acts very similar to a voucher in practice, but the way it's legally done is a little different. But then there's a homeschool tax credit of, I believe it's $2,000, that allows families just to deduct off their taxes with a simple checkbox like, did I do this? This is the most freedom we see. It's a small dollar, but it's there. You have a couple other programs that started during the pandemic. Idaho has Strong Students, Strong Families. This is a micro grant program. This allows for supplemental dollars to follow kids into their families' hands to provide supplemental action. You don't have to leave the public school to get access to this money. Programs similar to that exist in Kansas with Kansas Keep and in Ohio with Ohio ACE, allowing families to do that as well. These mainly came out of the pandemic, but some are going to stick around. Idaho's is going to stick around. It was formula funded. It's in their budget, and they're going to have this ongoing micro grant concept for families. So what school choice is now, to me, educational freedom, which then opens up, Isaac, a much bigger conversation. So what does open enrollment mean in that? What does part-time enrollment in Kansas mean in that? What does it mean to rethink how you formulate your education? And obviously, we're talking a lot about that at OpenEd, but the ability to truly customize. And, people who are opposed to these programs love to talk about the lack of uptake, the lack of number of families who are actually utilizing all these programs that exist. But I think it's a culture shift has to happen and is happening in America to make people more interested in customizing their education, or as I like to say, owning that process, and versus it being a government service. And I think ultimately underlying is a government service question.
There's a funny little anecdote I stumbled across earlier this week in terms of the uptake, because I think I heard from you one time, some crazy number, that there's hundreds, thousands of different sort of school choice type programs across the country. You have all sorts of different school districts that have virtual charters or that have this or that option. So like theoretically, and the percentage of people that are eligible for them versus the percentage that actually, enroll in them is quite low. But when you start to look into the details, I was looking just recently, I think it was in Tennessee, and they have some kind of program. It's kind of like an ESA type of a thing. But when you look at the fine print, it's like students, you have to be in one of 3 counties. You have to have attended a specific school for at least 3 years and then go to transfer to some other school, and it lasts you 1 year. And you're like, by the time I fill out all the criteria and paperwork, I get it for 1 year. I'm not going to, most people have never heard of it. It's not marketed. Whoever runs it doesn't have an interest in marketing it.
Right.
And even if it were, it's like, okay, so technically maybe 20,000 students could qualify, but that's 20,000 students this year. And it's always a different 20,000 every year. And it's like, there's so many that are actually not truly universal or easy to access.
Correct.
So it's kind of a misleading thing to say that the uptake is really low.
It's really funny you mentioned that. It's like the world's worst choose your own adventure book. So
Yes.
you're choosing your own adventure, trying to get qualified, only to then fall off and not be qualified. It exists as an opportunity to experiment with choice in Tennessee, but fell far short of its dream. Now we expect Tennessee to bring it back this year and have more conversations about it. But you hit on something really important. The people who administer these programs don't have an incentive to drive enrollment in these programs. They are program administrators. They're just there to make sure they're operating. Sometimes,
I mean, frankly, in many cases, their job gets harder the more enrollments there are, and they don't have the ability to have like incentive bonuses and things like that. That's often explicitly prohibited. So,
well, you also run into this situation where we fixed the movement has fixed this, but historically, everybody thought education programs needed to be in Department of Educations. And then you were setting up these freedom-esque programs in places whose whole mission was to keep people in the system.
Yeah.
They weren't actually designed to think about how to empower somebody to get outside the system. They were designed to be inside. So you had this poor state bureaucrat who's sitting in an office going, my job is to help families get out. And everybody else in his building is like, no,
yep.
that is not happening. And so I think the move that we saw in 2015 to move these programs to, in that case in Nevada, to Treasury, and we've seen that model repeated over and over, creates the right incentive structure. And I think it's important for people to understand why in 2015 they moved the program into Treasury. And that's because it was a fundamental shift of, was this a banking product or was this an educational program? So what was the purpose of an education savings account? And we can credit this to Senator Becky Harris in Nevada, who was the chairman of education. And she saw the bill and it was in her committee and she goes, this isn't an education bill. And she called Treasury and asked us to review it in Treasury. And we looked at it and she was, what is it? And I said, well, it sure looks like a bank account that like you're putting money in and then you're spending it on allowable things. Sure looks like a health savings account if you ask me. And next thing I knew, there was a bunch of red lines in a bill and suddenly it's in Treasury, which was fine because it really set the right incentives. You know, what is the role of government in these programs? It's to ensure the money moves appropriately and that the guardrails are met. And that's not about the education side of the program. It's about the process.
Yeah. And that's a great, so I want to put a pin on that one for a second, because many people listening, if you came from a more radical homeschool background like I did, that's like, we're just used to being completely outside of the system. We know that we're not going to get the tax dollars back that are going to the public school, but in return, nobody bugs us. We're completely left alone. You know, it depends on the state you're in. You're not completely left alone. But so when we have these conversations about, you know, education freedom stuff, there's always the option. Yeah. As long as it's legal, and it pretty much is in every state. Yeah. You can just opt out of the system. You're not going to get any money back you're not going to get any government money or get your taxes back, but you do your thing. That is always on the table. Anyone who is in a position where they're capable of doing that, and then great. Then you move to the next thing. Okay. If there is a concern that there are people who are not going to be able to afford a type of education that, you know, maybe they want, and someone, it could be a private foundation or it could be a government, wants to help fund people who can't afford it to do some form of, you know, free educational freedom. Both of those entities, whether it's a private foundation or a government, they now face a problem. What is the best mechanism to get money to people who want it for an education? Do we just start a school ourselves and run the school, which is what both public and private schools do? That's like the first thought. We'll just run the whole thing. but then that's very uniform. Now everybody's crammed into the same system. Okay, do we have we create grants for multiple types of schools, and government kind of does that with charter schools in some ways. It's sort of like, hey, there's some room to compete and try to become a government school that's different. There's some room for that. Private foundations do stuff like that. Then there's the next level down. Well, what if we just gave the money directly to the recipients and then put some kind of strictures around it, so they're not, let's say, using it for drugs or something like that, and it's creating this problem that's worse than what we would set out to solve. And again, put aside whether this is coming through government or a private foundation, they both face these same problems. Now, governments have some additional political considerations and all kinds of other things involved, but at the end of the day, that's kind of what put aside for a second whether you think government should just have nothing to do with education at all. That's fine. But given that they do, and that there's this desire to get funds to help more people have a quality education, that's where all of these conversations come in. All ways to get money to people to help them with an education are not created equal. So a charter school and a voucher and an ESA and a tax credit, they all have different pros and cons. They have unintended consequences. They have weird bedfellows and weird enemies you wouldn't expect. So I think that's what's interesting to me is how do we try to judge and compare? So I would love to ask you kind of one at a time. Give me a quick take on a couple of these options, like vouchers, biggest pro, biggest con, limitation. A voucher is government takes money and gives it to somebody, but it's not cash. It's a ticket that can only buy certain things, which is tuition at an accredited private school. Give me the pros and cons of vouchers.
Yeah, I mean, the pro, very simple to understand most of the time. Pick a private school. Let's use Indiana as an example here. You pick the private school. The private school goes through the process of helping you register for the voucher. The incentives are aligned. The private school's looking for money. Private school's going to help family. Family gets out there, can give the check. The check goes direct from government to private school. There's very little chance of fraud here. It's very clean. Bureaucrats and legislative officials are excited because they know it's going to an accredited school. So everybody's kind of really happy about the safe box that you're in. Con, and I've said this on the trail a lot, talking about educational freedom. Many times, unfortunately, you can't tell much of a difference in the education of a child in a public school, private school, charter school. Maybe the paint tastes better on the wall, but it's still kids in rows, it's desks. Maybe get a little bit more freedom. So you're moving kids from one box to another box. Is that box better? Maybe. Is it nicer? Probably. But you're not transforming the educational outcome or trajectory of a child. So that's
you kind of have that choke point of the accreditation cartel, let's say.
Yeah.
And so if we're saying, hey, it can go to not just a public school, but any accredited school. Okay. Then the next question becomes, why does the accreditation process result in all of the schools looking so similar? And you have two options, right? You can say, well, let's keep the voucher idea and let's change what it means to be accredited. Let's redefine accreditation and let's open that up. Or you can say, let's run the funds somewhere else. Let's not just give them to accredited schools. Let's give them to something broader than that. Because the other issue that vouchers have is constitutionally in most states, you have separation of church and state. Sure. You can't give money from a government to a religious institution, but some of the better schools are religious. Sure. So if instead you can give the money as a grant to the parent and allow them to spend it, they can spend it on a religious institution. So something like a tax credit, which they get a refundable tax credit given to them, just like you would get a tax credit for anything else. But the fact that it's refundable means you get it even if you didn't pay that much. Then you can use that to apply it to whatever. So am I correct in that was kind of the next step in the school choice conversation after vouchers, or no?
So you had vouchers, then you had tax credit scholarships. Okay. And these are tax credits that are corporate tax credits that are given to corporations who fund scholarship organizations who then write checks to families and they can use them on schools. Now, many times they still look a lot like vouchers. So you get the company writes a check to a nonprofit. That nonprofit has kids apply for those scholarship dollars. Those kids select which school they're going to, and then the check is sent from scholarship organization over to the school. Tuition's taken care of. You're moving on. Now, why this has gotten kind of interesting is in some places you get private schools who open up their own foundations to accept tax credit money into those foundations to then be able to fund kids to go back to their same schools. So you get a lot of people playing in the sandbox trying to get families to do it. There are places that limit the number of scholarship granting organizations, but again, these tax credits have some of the similar pitfalls as maybe a voucher in the sense that we're back to accredited schools. We get religious schools now, but with some Supreme Court changes, we can get religious schools now in regular vouchers. Here's where they're really scary. The funding isn't guaranteed. So I now have kids who are in schools, and let's say we have an economic downturn, and suddenly the scholarship granting organization cannot meet the demand of their number of scholarships you've got. So now you've got kids who are having to have their education uprooted in the middle of maybe their elementary school or junior high, and they're having to find new schools because they don't have funding available. So these programs are much more susceptible to the economic conditions of the country and where people are going. They're also, unfortunately, subject to the political realities. And so in Florida, when we had some of the Disney issues blowing up in Florida, it changed how companies wanted to write checks, where they were giving money to. And so when politics gets involved, everything gets crazy. I think the only thing everybody who listens to this can agree is we should get politics out of education. And right now, tax credits to scholarship organizations are politically affected and economically affected. Makes it very difficult.
It's funny. We mentioned Milton Friedman because he was kind of one of the early voucher guys, but I'll never forget, he has this little framework. I don't even remember where, one of his books, but of the 4 ways to spend money. And you can spend your own money on yourself. You're going to be the most judicious and the most efficient when you do that. You can spend your own money on someone else, like buying them a gift. You're not going to be quite as scrutinous. Like if the thing you buy isn't the best value, you don't have to live with it, but you do want it to be nice because it's a gift and it's your money. You can spend someone else's money on yourself. You're going to do a pretty good job, not quite as good as if it was your own money, but you're going to, and then the worst is someone else's money on someone else. I get to spend Grant's money on a stranger I've never met before. How good a job am I going to do of making sure that those dollars are well used? And I think that's kind of when you say, okay, government wants to get in the game of helping people have access to education. What's the best way to do it? The closer that those dollars can be to the parents and the students, the more efficient, the better the outcome is going to be. But those mechanisms that come in between, there's so many different ways and they all have trade-offs. If we were to start from scratch, you think about with food, if you want to help more people have access to food, well, currently government has various like food stamp programs and things. I think few people would say, you know what we should do? Government should take over the entire supply chain for foods, open its own grocery stores, source everything, do all the marketing, do all the, no, we have a very robust competitive market for food. Just give people food stamps or bridge cards or whatever, and they can go pick it from the grocery stores. If we were starting from scratch, I think education, that would be kind of a no-brainer, but we're starting from a spot today where the entire industry is dominated by government-run institutions, and they are in most states the largest employer in that state. Mm-hmm. They're not going anywhere anytime soon, whether you like it or not. And so the question is, public schools do exist, but we want more than that for people. How do we try to get there in the way that's the most feasible, the most efficient, that has the least, problems associated with it? And I mean, as you can see, I think the fact you can have a 1,000 different experiments is going to help tremendously, but this is not an easy fix. It's not something you can just simplify overnight.
No, it's not. And You talk about the other programs that are kind of direct to beneficiary type operations, food stamps, EBT cards, Social Security, and these things. They all have one thing kind of in common. They're dealing with adults. And while food stamps, obviously are feeding children at homes, the risk tolerance that society seems to have around education is incredibly different than they have helping a senior citizen, giving them money to live on Social Security. There's just so much more, I guess, less risk tolerance for dealing with kids. And at the core of the educational freedom discussion is, do we trust parents? That's the core. It doesn't, forget about everything else. Do you trust the parent to lead the child's educational journey to a point at which the child can lead their own education journey?
I actually like to change the question slightly, because I think if you ask, do you trust parents, it's too easy to fall into the nirvana fallacy where you compare how well the parents are going to do to some fictionalized ideal of like what would be the best case scenario. I like the question, who is more likely to produce the better outcome? Parents having control or bureaucrats having control? And I will side with parents every time. That doesn't mean that I don't acknowledge that there are plenty of individual cases where parents are going to do a bad job, as all of us do on many things. But I want to compare apples to apples. Like, look, the options on the table are parents having more control on this scale or bureaucrats having more control. And I would go the parent side every time, but I don't want to compare it to some like idealized vision that's not possible.
I think it's fair. I think the movement has taken a dramatic shift since COVID, and I think we have to acknowledge COVID as a point in this discussion. And
changed everything. I mean, I can tell you, Grant, just anecdotally, as homeschooling my whole life, since COVID, you cannot go out in public with your kids a day without other parents asking you about why your kids are in school, you homeschool, and saying they're thinking about it, they're curious about it, and having a positive reaction to it. That was not the case pre-COVID. You would have that sometimes, but it's like universal now. Like everyone is suddenly curious about what more might be possible for their child educationally in a way that was not the case before.
But I think so. That's right, and I think it's important to recognize. I for a long time had been looking for a way to talk about this and find the commonality and common ground that people could talk about educational freedom. There are very few times in American history where you can find one demographic of people who have one thing in common with each other, who all experienced the exact same pain point. Even 9/11, it sparked amazing patriotism across America. But if you were in New York or Washington on 9/11, your experience and your feelings are vastly different than Grant Hewitt, who was at the Texas Christian University dorm room that morning watching it on the Today Show. Except now we're talking about parents and COVID and school closures, and almost every parent in America for 2 weeks in March of 2020 experienced the exact same thing. And so what I witnessed happened in the movement is that what I like to call parent on parent violence dramatically decreased. It used to be you were judging other parents were judging each other where their kids went to school. And now you see parents going, what works for you, man. That's great. Like that didn't happen without COVID. And then you get this concept of, does learning happen everywhere? It doesn't just happen in a classroom. There were some states, if you want to talk about educational freedom to another degree, there were some states that were ahead. New Hampshire had a program called Learn Everywhere, where you were starting to accredit learning in K-12 that happened outside, whether it was 4-H or internships with businesses. Like that was pre-COVID, but getting people to talk about it, totally different conversation after COVID. The idea that you could be a student in a public school and a private school at the same time, or a public school and a homeschool, or a public school and a hybrid, that was very different. I think one of the things that really changed is what became innovative in education shifted. after COVID. And so micro schools, school choice platforms shifted. But really, it used to be pre-COVID, what technology was it? The ed tech business was huge. That's what was called innovation, was some new curriculum, or maybe it was VR goggles. What became innovative post-COVID was, how did a school or an education system think about staffing differently, the building differently, and time differently.
Yep.
And that's what really became innovative. And so, as you saw this explosion of 1,000 flowers blooming across America, you were seeing people, everyday entrepreneurs like yourself, Isaac, and others, who were saying, I'm going to rethink the classroom. I'm going to rethink who is a teacher. I'm going to rethink, how do I fund that? I'm going to rethink all these things that have led to an explosion of innovative learning environments. But they all have really one thing in common. They're rethinking their staffing, who, they're rethinking where and how, and they're rethinking when. And
Yeah,
that's
this is
changing.
this is a good transition to talk about the sort of the last item on your ESAs. And first, I want to mention micro schools. Micro schools and ESAs are related, but they're separate. So the concept of the micro school, it's so simple. Imagine if you're a teacher in the public school system and you're, maybe in your first couple years, maybe you're making 50 grand in benefits or something. And you're teaching a classroom of 20, 30 kids, and you have a lot of strictures put on you. You gotta teach to the tests. You got to do all kinds of things coming from the state, local, and federal level. Not easy. And then you have this realization, what if I just taught like 10 kids and each of them was able to pay me like 5 or 6 grand for a year? And I had this highly tailored 10 kid, and maybe some of them can bring their sibling, that it doesn't even have to be like strict age delineation. And like, I'm a really talented teacher and I have a bunch of upside here. And you think about families, if they can afford that, wow, that's such a great experience. And so like the micro school concept has always been there, but that funding component, it's the, if they can afford it. You introduce ESAs. Let's just give parents a spending account and they can use it on private school tuition if they want. They can use it for classes. They can use it for books. Now, suddenly, you've got a lot of public school teachers, private school teachers, homeschool moms, all of the above, saying, I can run a micro school. And I don't even need a building. There are churches that are vacant 6 days a week. There are all kinds of places where we can go. And homeschoolers have been doing things like this a little more loosely, called co-ops, for a long time. But this micro school concept, I think just the word itself helped capture a large chunk of the market who would be turned off by the idea of homeschooling because they kind of like the school component. But they all understand, every advocate of schooling is a fan of smaller class sizes and a better teacher to student ratio. And like a micro school, it's like a little less heavy duty. It's not so bureaucratically top heavy, a little more flexible. It's a closer relationship with teacher to. And so it's been interesting to see this explosion of like what's old is new again. This is like the old one-room schoolhouse, I mean, it's back. And so ESAs, I think, and like all of a sudden in the span of a couple years, it went from like 1 or 2 or 3 states to 17 states have some kind of ESA. And there's a lot of really cool, exciting things there. But there's also some interesting and weird side effects and some unanswered questions about how to administer these darn things and some weird incentives at play. I would love your good, bad, and ugly on ESAs.
We could do a whole podcast on this, but super high level, ESAs are the second best thing that we have today to getting to a mixed economy in education. So getting to a place where money is flowing and you still have the monopoly there and money can get to families. The ESA movement since 2015 has gone through a couple iterations, but really in 2020, 2021, the movement as a whole got behind universal access to ESAs, which was really big. What we learned intuitively, we didn't understand, but we learned it eventually, was that it didn't matter how much freedom you wanted to provide, if it was for 100 kids or 1,000 kids or 1,000,000 kids, the opposition to freedom was going to fight it at the exact same level as if it was a 1,000,000 kid program or a 100 kid program. They just viewed it as such a threat to the ecosystem of their existence that happened. So the shift to universal became huge, and you started getting the dominoes to drop, whether it's West Virginia, uh, Arizona, Iowa, Arkansas, Florida, coalesces around 7 programs and creates a universal concept. So great movement on this front. Now every kid can apply. Here's where it fell short. Um, it fell short because at the same time the movement was so focused on getting every kid in the program, it forgot to protect the back door of how the money flows out the program. And now you see post West Virginia and Arizona a ratcheting down of the allowable expenses that are allowed to be spent out of an ESA. So it's starting to look more and more like a voucher, where you are finding accredited school language. You're finding licensed teachers as tutors. You're not seeing this freedom of the ecosystem start to develop. And the more you ratchet down how it can be spent, the more you create market forces that do not drive innovation, and it creates a lack of or stagnant growth of the education market.
Because if you're a potential vendor and you want to offer some unique kind of educational experience to people who have these ESA dollars, and you just don't know year to year, semester to semester, how the criteria are going to change and whether you'll be eligible, you're not going to sink a lot into, building that out and making it a big thing. So there's been a little bit of a stagnation in the ecosystem on the vendor side because there's been lack of clarity. But then you also just think about the incentives for whatever nonprofit, government agency, or for-profit wins a contract to administer these things. If the idea is people can get dollars and they can spend them on all kinds of things and they can submit them for reimbursement or buy them directly on a marketplace or both, it's very hard to imagine a scenario where the lawmakers that issue this thing, they want it to be a good PR win and a political win. And it looks bad for them if there's one newspaper story that says, we found a family that used ESA dollars to buy a trip to Disney World, and they claimed it was an educational expense. This is a fraud. This is a scam. This is being abused. Whether or not it's true, whether or not Disney World is educational, it's going to look bad. So the lawmakers have an incentive to go to whoever is running these things and be like, hey, I don't care what you do, but don't make me embarrassed by approving something that's going to look bad. So those administrators, what's their incentive? Risk aversion. They get no upside for taking a chance and approving a swing set or a bicycle that could be a cool educational thing. It's only downside risk. So over time, they're going to want to narrow. So it's this process. Like you can kind of predict where it's going, but it's also like a high administrative burden to make all these choices. So if you're, when you think about other more private industries, they will simply bake in an allowable percent of like fraud and abuse. Like retail, they're like, hey, we know we're going to have employee theft and it's going to be roughly this much, and we'll bake that in. Yeah, we'll try to limit it, but we can't get it to zero, and we're not going to be scared of it not being zero. But you don't have that approach here because of the politics of it. If you run this as an administrator and you say, look, we're going to have like 2.5% fraud and misuse, and we're going to reimburse things that we shouldn't have, we'll eat the cost. We can bake that in. That's okay financially, but it's not okay from a political PR standpoint. If you come up with that one time somebody bought some hemp or a bong, you know what I mean? They get reimbursed for a bong or a 6-pack of Bud Light, and it's like game over, right?
We're not going to talk about it, but they still use the same example out of Arizona that occurred in like 2015 or 2014 as justification in every debate in the country around ESAs. There was one bad spin, and we still talk about it. But I think you're hitting on something. You used a word that to everybody listening is like, it seemed common sense. You said misuse of funds. This is how we talk about the misuse of Medicaid dollars, Medicare dollars. It's misuse. In education, when you talk about an education savings account, the only word used is fraud. No one uses misuse. In fact, you can't find it anywhere. Everybody's like, no fraud, no fraud. If you had the same requirement on Medicaid as you did on an education savings account, we wouldn't be treating anybody in this country. We wouldn't write a check in healthcare, but they don't. There's just something different about how people get their heads around that kind of usage and this kind of usage. And I do believe that however you want to frame the question, it continues to come back to a deep rooted belief in parents. And do you believe in the neighbor across the street has the ability to educate their kid or not? And that's just the reality that we sit in. I said earlier that education savings accounts were the second best
Yeah.
movement towards the free market. What we're seeing in Oklahoma in their homeschool tax credit is by far the best. It is a simple check the box, trust the family that they actually did it. But look at Oklahoma in their two direct tax credit programs, not scholarship programs, but direct. $7,000 for people choosing a private school accredited, or $2,000 for homeschool. They didn't trust those homeschoolers enough to do it. They're only giving them $2,000. And when you look at the appropriation allowed under those tax credits, they are vastly different. And that was one of the things I wanted to point out about ESAs. We have yet to see an ESA. Sorry, I didn't say yet. Arizona does this. But in most ESA programs, they're still funded by an appropriation. So you are still at the mercy every single fiscal year to having the debate at the legislature of how much are we going to fund the program. And that in and of itself limits freedom. And we shouldn't have that. But, I think there's another conversation we had another time, Isaac, about the ecosystem and the development of the unconventional learning models in this country. They have exploded. I would contend, though, they exploded to meet the demand of families, not access to government money. The National Microschooling Center based in Las Vegas, Nevada, has some really interesting research on this where they point out that I think it's less than 10% of microschool leaders that they talk to actually accept any government money. And families are finding ways to pay for this education differently. They're finding ways to negotiate differently. They're thinking, okay, I can't afford 5 days. I'm going to pay for 2 days. Can I volunteer my services to the school to get my kid in?
Well, I mean, that's what I was going to point out about Oklahoma. It's so funny. Even the fact that they're like, okay, $7,000 for private school, which will probably cover half of tuition, $2,000 for homeschoolers. It almost like acknowledges how freaking efficient these homeschool parents are. The average cost, if you factor in federal, state, whatever, for a public school student is like 15 to 20K a year in most states. These I've never met a more resourceful group in my life than homeschool moms. And this is not, by the way, we're like, trust parents, they can educate their kids. For those of you who have thought about taking your kids and taking control of their education, it doesn't mean you are literally teaching them every subject and you have to be a genius. It's just, can parents figure out the right mix of environment, resources, and activities that are good for their kids? That's really what it is. It's not like you being a genius and teaching them. But these homeschool moms, it's incredible what they will pull off, the way that they will find bargains and find things, and the efficiency with which they can have their kids have an excellent world-class education on an absolute shoestring. It like shows you what's possible. So this idea that it's only possible to have a great education if you can spend 15, 20 grand a kid, like that's totally untrue. If you remove some of these hurdles and people can kind of realize how much, especially when you have a thriving ecosystem in some of the cities I've lived with, a great homeschool community, how much people can come together and pool their resources and do things very, very efficiently.
The truth is families will figure it out. Parents will figure it out. I'm always drawn to this mom I met in Las Vegas. Her name is Patricia Farley. Patricia Farley has 4 kids. 2 of them are adopted. They're all very different kids. Her kids were all in all types of schools, and but mainly private and public schools. There was a time in Patricia's last 5 years that she had a kid in a micro school, a kid in a charter, a kid in a virtual. Like they were just everywhere because you found what was needed for that child and she went and did it. And one of the things she would tell every parent she talked to is you can do it. You just have to decide that you want that ownership over the process and not outsource it. And that's the transitioning that's happening in America is we are seeing the shift of government service to a product that's valued. And if you value that product, you're going to do a lot of things to make that product better. But the other thing we have learned over the last 5-6 years that is super important to anybody listening is that what families really want is to not be forced into one solution or the other. And I call this don't force the divorce. Don't force a family into a zero-sum game where you can't have support of your neighborhood school and you can't homeschool or you can't go to private. You can have it all. If the system is willing to evolve into a place where it is segmentable or you bundleable, you can figure out how you want to do that if you unbundle education. But families don't want to be forced into a one size fits all solution. They want flexibility. But they also, everybody has an affinity for their local school. I have an affinity for the school across the street. Doesn't mean the kids go there, but I love that school. It's great. Don't force that divorce. And families will be a lot more open to having a big and open, honest conversation about education. But when they feel like their local school is being attacked, I don't care what they say about the condition of education in America. They think their neighborhood school is great.
Yeah.
It's why they moved there for years. I mean, we didn't talk about the ultimate school choice or educational freedom, and that's where you buy your house.
Yeah.
And that's for many Americans, still the majority of Americans, that's the only form of choice they have is where do they buy their house? So we should take this and have another conversation about how do we fix that problem, because that's a very different problem. But that's school choice to the average American. Where do I buy my house?
As you were describing the don't force the divorce, hey, I want my high school sports team and band, and I want my online classes, and I want my cool charter school over here, and I want my homeschool. It's almost like what we need is an open education, right, Grant?
It is. It is. Absolutely. I want to lead. I want to give you this one too. For years, people have looked at Idaho's microgrant program and been so confused by it because originally ESA take rates were less than 10%. Like people just didn't take them. When you didn't force the divorce, when the Idaho team created a program that didn't force parents to leave their school, but gave them access to resources to customize their education. They only gave them $50 million to start with. That $50 million was gone in 48 hours and ended up being about 25% of the Idaho education population got access to that money instantly. Why? We didn't force a fake decision. We didn't say, I've got to be out of this school to get access to this. We said, here's the resources you need to customize your education. You want to stay in your public school, stay in your public school. We don't care. It was gone instantly. This is where the market is. This is where families are. It's much less restrictive, and families are looking to be able to have what they like and what they need at the same time.
I love it, Grant. What an awesome spot to end. I think I've got like 50 million rabbit trails to go down now. You're encyclopedic in your knowledge of all these states and programs. Thank you so much for having the conversation. Thanks everybody for listening. If you haven't subscribed to the OpenEd Daily, go to opened.co, subscribe. It's an amazing newsletter, some little daily tidbits in there. Until next time on the OpenEd podcast.